Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to really get you the essential thinking from those big foundational works that shape our world. Today, we're jumping into E.H. Carr's incredibly influential book, The 20 Years Crisis, 1919-1939. And, this isn't just a history lesson. It came out first in 1939, right on the edge of World War II, then updated in 46. Carr himself said he wrote it to fix a, quote, glaring and dangerous defect in how English-speaking countries thought about international politics between the wars. And that defect, an almost total neglect of the factor of power.
That's quite a statement to kick things off, isn't it? Carr wasn't just looking at, the immediate sparks that start wars. He wanted to dig much deeper, find the underlying and significant reasons for international conflict. And he dedicated the book to the makers of the coming peace. That really tells you something. He clearly felt that a really honest, maybe even brutal understanding of power was absolutely vital if we weren't going to just repeat history. And that's what we're aiming to unpack for you today.
Okay, so let's start right there, at the foundation of Carr's argument. He suggests political science, well, like other sciences, really, it pops up because people want it. There's a demand to solve problems. And he sees this pattern. First, an infantile and utopian period, kind of wishful thinking dominates. Then comes the hard and ruthless analysis. Think of, like, medieval alchemists trying to turn lead into gold. All purpose, no real regard for the facts of chemistry.
Right. And here's where Carr throws a curveball. He argues that unlike, say, physics or medicine, where your goal curing cancer, for instance, is totally separate from the facts you investigate, political science can never fully shake off that utopian element, the very desire for, a world state or collective security.
Huh?
That desire itself is a political fact that needs analysis. It kind of turns our usual idea of mature thinking on its head.
So he's not saying pick one or the other, ideals versus facts.
No, not at all. For Carr, utopia and reality, they're like two facets of political science. You need both. They're both essential for a complete picture. You can't just dismiss the idealists or the cynics. You need to see how they interact.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. A crucial distinction. So, keeping that in mind, let's dig into the utopian side first. Where does Carr trace its modern roots?
Well, he traces modern utopian political thought back to the breakup of the medieval system. That whole unified worldview collapsed.
Yeah.
And this, he argues, led to this new idea that you could establish moral law scientifically, just using reason. Almost like Newton figuring out physical laws.
Right, the Enlightenment dream.
Exactly. It's that 18th century rationalist faith that enlightenment was the royal road to the millennium. You had thinkers like Jeremy Bentham really pushing this. He believed the greatest happiness of the greatest number, well, that was natural law. And the optimistic bit was thinking people would just follow it if they understood what was good for them.
It sounds almost, well, quaint now, doesn't it? That sheer faith in reason.
It does. And it really flowered in the 19th century into this liberal conviction that public opinion, if you just presented the facts rationally, would inevitably judge right and then act rightly.
Okay, so that's the domestic picture. What happens when this rationalist faith goes global? You mentioned Woodrow Wilson.
Ah, yes, Wilson. He's a key figure here for Carr. Deeply influenced by this 19th century optimism, Wilson essentially tried to transplant it directly onto the international stage. Carr basically argues that the League of Nations was a massive attempt to apply Lockean liberalism, reason, individual rights, government by consent, to build a whole machinery of international order.
And what were the core beliefs driving that experiment? What was the mechanism supposed to be?
Fundamentally, it was this unwavering belief in the compelling power of reason, particularly as expressed through public opinion. Wilson, for example, Carr points out, genuinely seemed to think that if he could just speak to enough of them, the ordinary people, reason would win out, even against their own leaders.
Like his appeal to the Italian people?
Exactly. Going over the heads of their delegation at the peace conference is quite remarkable. And this faith led to things like the Bryan Treaties, suggesting a whole year's delay before war, just trusting that rational discussion would cool things down. Early League supporters, people like Lord Cecil, they saw public opinion as the ultimate weapon, not armies, not economics, but public opinion. They often even sort of glossed over the actual sanctions parts of the League Covenant.
But as we know all too well, this utopian vision didn't last. Carr identifies the harmony of interests doctrine as a key failure point. Tell us about that.
Right, that was a cornerstone belief, wasn't it? Popularized by Adam Smith's laissez-faire economics. The idea that it's individuals, and by extension nations, just pursued their own self-interest, it would all magically add up to benefit the whole world. Think universal free trade, national self-determination. These were seen as paths to automatic global peace and prosperity, a natural harmony.
And Carr just demolishes that idea.
Pretty much. He shows how that harmony was shattered. First, Darwinism creeps in, introducing this idea of survival of stronger, even in economics. Competition wasn't always benign. Then look at the treaties after World War I. Carr argues they weren't about ensuring harmony at all. They were often explicitly designed to eliminate competitors. That's hardly harmonious.
Very different reality.
And then the big test, the failure of League sanctions in 1936 against Italy. That was a brutal reality check. It showed very clearly that economic power is impotent if the military weapon is not held in readiness to support it. Just cutting off trade wasn't enough. And public opinion. Turned out it could be manipulated, wrong-headed, or simply powerless.
So Carr's conclusion is pretty devastating then.
It really is. He calls it the bankruptcy of the conception of morality that had held sway for 150 years. It wasn't just, that people failed to apply the right principles out of stupidity or wickedness. The truly chilling part was his conclusion that the principles themselves were false or inapplicable.
Wow. Okay, so if utopianism crashes and burns because it ignores power and reality, what about realism? Where does that leave us? Is it just cynicism?
Well, Carr definitely presents realism as the necessary corrective, the pendulum swing back. Its roots go deep back to Machiavelli wanting the real truth of a matter than imagined. See things as they are. And Hobbes, of course, was his famous line, before the names of just and unjust can have place, there must be some coercive power. Power comes first.
It certainly strips away the comforting illusions. What's the core idea of this realist perspective, according to Carr?
For the realist, reality is basically the whole sweep of history, the whole course of historical evolution. It often feels quite deterministic. So when they say might is right, Carr clarifies, it doesn't usually mean might makes something morally good. It means history decides what counts as a right. History creates rights and therefore right. It's descriptive. And theories often follow events, like empire precedes imperialism. The theory comes later to explain what happened, not to guide it. He also brings in the sociology of knowledge, this idea that even our ethics are shaped by history and often used as weapons in power struggles.
That's fascinating. So the realist exposes how supposedly universal principles are often just national interests in disguise.
Exactly. Carr says the realist reveals how supposedly absolute and universal principles were not principles at all, but the unconscious reflections of national policy based on a particular interpretation of national interest at a particular time.
Can you give that example he uses again? Wilson versus Brand.
Yes, it's a brilliant one. Wilson, deciding America should enter the war, declares, the right is more precious than peace. Then you have Briand trying to preserve the post-war settlement that benefits France, saying, peace comes before all. Carr's point isn't about who was right. It's that these weren't timeless principles dictating policy. They were policies wrapped in the language of principles to justify them. A really crucial insight.
Okay, so pure utopianism is delusional, but pure realism sounds like it leads to just a naked struggle for power, making any kind of stable international order impossible. Neither works alone.
That's precisely Carr's central thesis. Sound political thought, effective political action, it has to combine both. You need the aspiration of utopia, but grounded in the reality of power.
It's like politics itself has this split personality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He talks about its dual character, coercion and conscience, enmity and goodwill. You have to reckon with both. He says it's fatal in politics to ignore power as it is to ignore morality. Ignoring either one leads to disaster. Think of his example of 19th century China, so convinced of its moral superiority, but contemptuous of power politics, and it paid a heavy price.
Right. And he describes power politics not as some aberration, but almost like a law of nature. The dictatorship of the great powers is just a fact.
It's a baseline reality for Carr. It's always there, shaping everything. The Locarno Treaty of 1925 is his classic instance. He shows how its effectiveness, its very meaning, depended entirely on the shifting balance of power between Germany, France, and Britain. It wasn't abstract law. It was power dynamics made concrete.
And he draws that very direct line between military and economic power. What about the idea of welfare states just focusing on people's well-being? Does he dismiss that?
He cuts through that distinction quite sharply. Yes, he links military and economic power directly. He loves Clausewitz's line. War is nothing but the continuation of political relations by other means. And Kister. Economic strength, for Carr, is always an instrument of political power. World War I just made that undeniable, leading to ideas like planned economy and measuring war potential.
Uh-huh.
As for welfare states versus power states, he sees it as often misleading. A welfare state, in his view, is typically a state that already has dominant power so it can afford the butter. The so-called power state is the one still striving to acquire that power, hence focusing on the guns. It's about position, not just intention. And he points to things like autarky aiming for self-sufficiency, controlling exports of capital, manipulating markets. These are all economic tools of power projection.
And then there's the power over mind's propaganda. Carr's writing, as mass media like radio and film are taking off.
Yes, and he connects it directly to industrialization. The mass production of opinion is the corollary of the mass production of goods. A very modern-sounding observation. He observes that big international ideas, think the French Revolution's ideals or the League of Nations, only gained real traction when they got hitched to national power. Propaganda, he argues, is pretty much ineffective as a political force until it acquires a national home and becomes linked with military and economic power. Ideas need muscle.
But does propaganda have limits?
Oh, yes. Even someone like Hitler, Carr notes, understood this. Propaganda needs some connection to reality, some measure of conformity with fact. You can't just sell poison as lotion indefinitely. And crucially, he believes it's limited by the inherent utopianism of human nature. People have an underlying sense of fairness or morality. They eventually resist the pure might makes right doctrine. It doesn't sit right long term.
Which brings us back to morality. After all this talk of power, does Carr think international morality actually exists in any meaningful way?
He tackles this head on. He argues the state, even though it's a construct, functions as an indispensable tool, this fictitious group person that we assign moral rights and duties to. And he thinks most people do accept some kind of international moral code rules against unnecessary cruelty and war, the idea that treaties should generally be kept. However, he stresses that a state's moral duty is widely seen as more limited by self-interest than the duty of the individual.
Ah, the Cavour quote.
Exactly. Cavour saying he'd do things for Italy that would make him seem like a scoundrel if he did them for himself. Carr calls it a curious paradox. An act that's clearly immoral in the individual may become virtue when performed on behalf of the group person. Patriotism can excuse a lot.
It does seem like a different set of rules applies.
And the international community just doesn't have the same cohesion as a nation. There's less sense of equality between members, less acceptance that the good of the whole takes precedence over the good of the part. So when a powerful nation claims to be the natural protector of the weaker communities or to have a higher ethic, Carr warns us to be skeptical. It's often just dressing up national interest as global good.
Okay, let's shift to law. People often want to see law as separate from politics, maybe even above it. Carr pushes back hard against that, doesn't he?
He really does. He sees that view as an illusion, a potentially dangerous one. International law, he points out, has no real police force, no world legislature. Its weakness just mirrors the embryonic character, the underdevelopment of the international community itself. Ultimately, he says, the authority of law, just like politics, is where ethics and power meet. Law doesn't exist in a vacuum. It always has a necessary political background.
What about the sanctity of treaties? Isn't that a core legal principle?
It is, but Carr unpacks it. He notes that before World War I, there was more flexibility. Concepts like rebus sic stantibus, basically, if circumstances fundamentally change or appeals to necessity, allowed states some wiggle room. After 1919, treaty interpretation became much more rigid, especially regarding the Versailles Treaty. But then, when states did break treaties, they often justified it on moral grounds, like arguing the treaty itself was unjust.
So, hypocrisy again.
Carr definitely sees hypocrisy. He argues treaties are often used as instruments of power, weapons used by the ruling nations to maintain their supremacy over those the treaties were imposed upon. He criticizes the way nations champion treaty law when it benefits them, then find moral loopholes when it doesn't. And this leads to the core problem he identifies. We've made war to change the status quo illegal, but we haven't created any effective international way to achieve peaceful change.
That seems like a massive gap. Because, as Carr bluntly states, without rebellion, mankind would stagnate and injustice would be irremediable. He even says force used, threatened, or just held in reserve is an essential factor in international change. How do you square that with peace?
It's the central dilemma, isn't it? And Carr argues that traditional legal or legislative approaches just don't work for peaceful change internationally. Why? because they pretend the parties are equal and try to ignore the power imbalances. He uses the League's Article 19, the one about reviewing inapplicable treaties. When was it actually invoked? Only when a state was already strong enough to threaten war. Power, not law, drove the process.
So legal mechanisms fail. What's his alternative? You mentioned a bargaining process.
Exactly. He argues for something more realistic, a bargaining process that explicitly acknowledges both morality and power. It requires give and take, crucially involving concessions from the stronger powers. It's not about abstract justice. It's about finding a workable compromise that reflects reality. He holds up the Anglo-Irish Treaty as a difficult but ultimately successful example. A forced compromise, maybe, but a lasting one. And he contrasts that sharply with the failure to reach a stable, peaceful settlement with Germany in the interwar years. A failure, he implies, rooted in ignoring the power realities until it was too late.
It's a sobering analysis. So pulling it all together, Carr's 20 Years Crisis is far more than just a history book. It's really a lens for understanding this constant, unavoidable dance between ideals and power that still shapes our world right now.
Absolutely. His ultimate conclusion is that the real international crisis wasn't just the slide towards war, but the final and irrevocable breakdown of the whole 19th century order. You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And he offers this quite provocative thought. Any new international order, any new harmony, can only be built on the basis of an ascendancy, meaning some dominant power or group of powers, which is generally accepted as tolerant and unoppressive, or at any rate, as preferable to any practicable alternative.
Which implies that the powerful need to exercise restraint.
Precisely. It requires a willingness not to insist on all the prerogatives of power and genuine self-sacrifice on the part of those who have. Power must be seen as relatively benign, or at least the best available option, to be accepted long-term. And he hints that economic reconstruction could be part of the answer, shifting focus from pure profit to things like employment, social stability. He notes that sheer necessity was already pushing nations in that direction domestically. Maybe it could work internationally.
It's clear Carr leaves us with a lot to think about, insights that feel incredibly current. We've really only scratched the surface here. But hopefully, this deep dive gives you some powerful new frameworks for understanding international relations. And it leaves us with that fundamental question Carr raised. If peaceful change is the core challenge, what kind of give and take, what kind of balance between power and morality do you think is needed for lasting peace today? What strikes you most about how ideals and power continue to collide and collude in our world?